There's a popular misconception that cruise ships dump their sewage overboard, but that's simply not true. Have you ever wondered, though, where all that waste on a cruise ship goes? Once, while I was relaxing in my stateroom on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, one of my daughters asked me where the poop went after she flushed the toilet, and it was actually a really good question. Cruise ships are often described as floating cities, and their waste management is no different than a small municipality. Icon, Star, and Legend of the Seas, which are the biggest cruise ships in the world, can accommodate up to 7,600 passengers, along with another 2,300 crew members. So that's almost 10,000 people on board. And with thousands of people on a ship, there is a need for a sophisticated approach to managing where everything goes once people are done with it, from human waste to recycling to leftover food. It's a logistical challenge to manage it all and keep it where it's supposed to go and not where it's not. When Titanic sailed 100 years ago, Titanic had lavatories that were communal bathrooms and private bathrooms located around the ship. Many cabins aboard Titanic had water closets and sinks, although toilets in first and second class did not have automatic flushing capabilities. After use, passengers in those cabins had to manually flush toilets because it was something they would have been used to doing on land. But toilets in third class on Titanic were equipped to flush automatically. This was done because of concern that passengers in steerage would have little to no familiarity with a toilet, having used mostly outhouses and chamber pots in the past. Since they may not have needed to know they have to flush, it was done for them. I think this era of shipping is where the myth about cruise ships today likely started, because back then, Titanic, at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, sewage drained directly from holes in the side of Titanic into the ocean. This system was not adjustable, so the sewage was left untreated. All of that could not be more different than it is today. In fact, cruise lines are highly regulated and work with government agencies to ensure their waste practices are approved. These protocols ensure ships comply with strict requirements set out by the International Maritime Organization and other regional and national authorities with a responsibility to protect the environment. In 1973, MARPOL Convention was introduced to establish global standards for sewage treatment that limit pollutant levels and designate restricted discharge zones. In 2003, sewage discharge from cruise ships was added to that. And Royal Caribbean ships go beyond International Maritime Organization standards and laws. We'll get to that in just a second. Cruise ships have wastewater treatment systems on board, similar to your hometown. As an example, Symphony of the Seas has about 7,000 passengers and crew on board, and that generates 210,000 gallons of black water and 1 million gallons of gray water during an average one-week cruise. All the wastewater on board is collected, and absolutely nothing goes overboard unless it was first run through a treatment plant. Additionally, they use a vacuum-based toilet system that reduces water usage per flush by about 75%. Water is divided into three categories on a cruise ship: gray water, which are sinks, laundries, and drains; black water, galleys and toilets; and bilge water, which is oils released from equipment in engine compartments that collect at the bottom of the vessel. Wastewater is run through this advanced wastewater purification plant on the ship, which is above the U.S. federal standard for purified water. When black water enters the integrated treatment system, it first passes into a bioreactor aeration chamber, which is filled with bacteria to break down the organic contaminants dissolved in the wastewater. The sewage then enters a membrane filtration system to further filter impurities. And in the settlement chamber, well, then dense substances sink to the bottom and the water floats to the top. The residual sludgy material is repeatedly returned for reprocessing. At the end of all of these cycles, whatever's left over is disposed of in low-emission incinerators. Finally, the clean sewage enters the disinfection chamber, where any remaining pathogens are sterilized by UV radiation. This leaves clean, safe, and bacteria-free water, which is transferred to a storage tank until it can be properly discharged. Believe it or not, the water that you find here is actually near tap water quality. The water is either kept on board or discharged overboard when the ship is at sea at certain distances from land in order to meet the different local and international regulations. The ability to discharge water depends on where the ship is located, as some oceans and areas prohibit the practice. But there's other ways you can use wastewater on board. As an example, at Perfect Day Coco Key, there's a state-of-the-art treatment system that enables them to use nearly 100% of the treated wastewater for things like landscaping irrigation, minimizing the need for other water sources. But it's really important to understand that Royal Caribbean, when they operate with their wastewater, all the stuff that goes down the toilet, goes well beyond the international maritime standards and laws. As an example, the water generated from that advanced wastewater purification system is only required to be discharged 3 nautical miles from land, but Royal Caribbean will do that and also at a speed of 6 knots or greater to help disperse it better. That's similar with black water as well, because the government says that it needs to be done 12 nautical miles or beyond 3 nautical miles if treated. But for Royal Caribbean, all black water must be treated and only discharged 12 nautical miles and at a speed of 6 knots or greater. In addition to all the wastewater, Royal Caribbean is actually producing a lot of its own water, and there's a reason to be able to use water on board the ship beyond simply sinks and for drinking. Royal Caribbean recognizes that fresh water is scarce in a lot of the places their ships visit, so they actually produce more than 90% of the fresh water used on the ships, including the water in many of the swimming pools, spas, and other recreational facilities. There are 2 ways they do this. First is through reverse osmosis. This system generates fresh water by taking seawater and passing it through a semi-permeable membrane at high pressure, allowing only water molecules to pass through. The other way is evaporation. This method boils seawater under negative pressure to create steam, which is then condensed in the fresh water. While this process is slightly more energy intensive than reverse osmosis, they offset it by repurposing all that extra heat from the ship's engines or steam from excess gas boilers to heat the water. Now, making their own water can't account for 100% of their needs, so occasionally they need to bunker water, which is the term for loading locally sourced fresh water onto the ship in port. But Royal Caribbean's goal is to minimize water bunkering in regions deemed to have, quote, extremely high water risk by 2025. Of course, we're just talking about what goes down the toilet, but there's other waste that gets generated on a cruise ship. As an example, the trash on board, whether it's a piece of plastic or cardboard or anything like that. Well, a lot of ships are changing how they're handling that as well. Ships like Symphony of the Seas, as an example, is actually a zero landfill ship. This means that it can deal with its own waste, ranging all the way from recycling to that water filtration we talked about earlier. Ships like Symphony have a designated waste and recycling center, and there are separate teams to deal with each incoming recyclable: glass, cardboard, plastic, and metal. The ship's waste incineration room is manned 24 hours a day by crew members who differentiate glass based on its color: green, brown, and white. It's then sent to be crushed later on. The ship has an incinerator as well as a compactor for processing plastic waste. The compactor crushes approximately 528 gallons of water bottles, and once it returns to port, it can then transport plastic, aluminum, paper, and glass for recycling through a third-party vendor. Waste that cannot be recycled is either offloaded for responsible disposal, including at waste-to-energy vendors at select ports, or incinerated on board. In 2023, Royal Caribbean Group ships recycled 76.7 million pounds of waste, and in 2024, that number jumped to 97.9 million pounds of waste. And then, of course, you have food waste, because if you've been on a cruise ship, you notice there's always plenty of uneaten food around, either food people leave on their plates or food that is never picked up from the buffet or ordered at a restaurant. Chefs on cruise ships segregate food scraps into different buckets, which is put into a big pipe that leaves the ship's hydroprocessor for incineration. Incinerating food waste reduces the volume of leftover food waste, and that reduces the ship's weight and thus fuel needed by the ship. To learn more about how Royal Caribbean is greatly reducing food waste so it doesn't have to get recycled at all, check out our next video, which dives exactly into how Royal Caribbean is using everything from AI to its crew members to make sure there's less food waste overall. Thanks for watching. This has been Matt from RoyalCaribbeanBlog.com, and we'll talk again real soon.